In occupied France during World War II, clothing was more than a personal choice, it was a survival essential. Fabrics disappeared from shops, leather became almost impossible to find, shoes wore out faster than they could be replaced, and for millions of civilians, keeping even a single outfit wearable for months required constant work, creativity, and resourcefulness. This is the second episode of Improvised France, how civilians built the resistance. Today, we're going to explore what happened when fashion, the pride of France, was squeezed by the German occupation, poverty, and extreme scarcity. We'll see how ordinary people adapted with ingenuity, dignity, and quiet defiance, finding ways to survive while preserving identity in a world that seemed determined to erase it. Even before the German troops marched into Paris, France's textile industry was already under severe strain. Mobilization in 1939 had pulled millions of workers from factories, and the transportation networks slowed to a crawl, and imports of raw materials dwindled. The factories that remained often operated with limited staff, supplies, and tooling, resulting in far less produced than what was needed to meet the nation's needs. When the German occupation of France began in 1940, the collapse became even more dramatic. By some estimates, up to 3/4 of the French textile production was diverted to Germany, leaving only about a quarter of the already limited output for the French civilians and the essential domestic needs of the nation. Wool, cotton, silk, thread, leather, and even buttons were commandeered for the Reich's war economy and war effort. Many factories were forced to switch production to meet German quotas, and transportation shortages meant that even what was produced, even locally, rarely reached civilian markets. By January 1941, clothing officially joined the list of rationed goods in France. Rationing cards, in this case civilian textile cards, dictated what people were allowed to buy, though in practice, most of these items simply didn't exist in the stores for people to get. Women might receive an allowance for a couple of dresses, a coat, minimal undergarments, and a single pair of shoes that was meant to last for years. Men fared even worse, often limited to a trouser, a shirt, and perhaps a jacket, and shoes intended to last multiple seasons. Looking at all these allocations, it becomes quickly apparent that it was essentially impossible to remain fully clothed throughout the year using only rationed items. Most civilians had to rely on clothing from before the rationing began, homemade garments or pieces obtained through bartering, informal networks, or even the black market. Later on, these same constraints applied even more heavily to the French resistance fighters and the Maquis. Fighters in the field had far fewer resources and faced even greater shortages, making improvisation, repair, and repurposing not just a matter of comfort, but of life and death. The skills civilians developed, reworking garments, patching shoes, and repurposing materials, later became invaluable for those living and fighting outside the cities, shaping the practical reality of life in the resistance. These wartime shortages were further compounded by an economic weapon that few civilians could control in 1940 France. The official exchange rate was set by the German occupying government of 1 Reichsmark to 20 francs. In reality, the franc was worth much more, but this allowed German soldiers to buy French goods cheaply, diverting food, shoes, bags, and clothing out of civilian hands and often sending them back to Germany. While this didn't create the shortages outright, it intensified the struggle, making survival and resourcefulness essential for almost every French household. With stores near empty and rationing coupons often useless, households turned to what the French called Système D, the art of making do, of repairing, reusing, and outsmarting shortages. Almost every household became a miniature workshop. Old garments were constantly reinvented, dresses were cut into skirts, skirts transformed into blouses, and adult clothing was repurposed for children. Odd items like parachute material or fabric feed sacks were reinvented into clothing to help make up for clothing shortages. Even the smallest scraps of fabric might become gloves, hat linings, or small bags. Nothing was really wasted. Knitting became almost a national activity. Wool from worn-out sweaters was often unraveled, washed, and reused to create new clothing items. Neighbors often shared knitting needles, passing them from one household to another to ensure that cold winters could be survived with warm, hand-knitted clothing. For perspective on why this was a survival essential, some sources note that due to fuel shortages, the interior of Parisian homes often went around 0 degrees Celsius in the winter. This made hand knitting clothing, repurposing garments, and carefully patched shoes not just practical, but literally a matter of life and death. Shoes were another issue. Leather was heavily requisitioned for the German military use, making it extremely scarce. Wooden soles became standard on newer shoes made under the occupation, and even for some repairs. As you might expect, these soles were sometimes stiff, clunky, and uncomfortable, though later they added padding that was corked to help dull the sound and increase comfort. In rural areas, shoes were even woven from plant fibers using basket and hat making techniques. Families patched and repaired what little they had using scrap leather, old rubber from discarded objects, and sometimes even pieces of wood to extend the life of their footwear. Cobbler shops were often overwhelmed, and many repairs had to be made at home as a result. Bags and other accessories were similarly adapted. Gas mask cases, belts, upholstery scraps, and old leather items were converted into functional handbags, shoulder bags, or other clothing items. The bags that they made often grew in size as they made them larger, not for fashion, but to better carry survival essentials for daily life. Fashion accessories were also hit as well with these shortages. Silk and nylon stockings disappeared almost overnight. Silk was blocked by supply line shortages, and nylon was requisitioned for military use. To circumvent these shortages, French women of World War II improvised using natural pigments from walnut, tea, and berries to tint their legs and simulate stockings. They often drew black lines along the back of their calves to mimic traditional seams. Later on, rayon stockings were introduced, but they tore easily. This gave rise to a new industry, stocking repairers, who worked in shop fronts under bright lights, charging by the centimeter of thread. For many, stockings were a symbol of personal pride and care, even under the rationing and occupation of Germany. Fashion occupied France was never just about appearance, it became a subtle form of defiance. The Germans sought to strip Paris of its cultural and economic power, moving the fashion industry north into Germany and restricting access to luxury materials. With French fashion houses under threat during World War II, ordinary civilians found ways to assert their identity in fashion through ingenuity and creativity. Hats and headwear were especially significant in occupied France in the 1940s. Turbans, berets, and simple caps were common, but women often stuffed their hats or turbans with unconventional materials to maintain the shape and the volume that was common for the era. And they did this when traditional fabrics and wadding were scarce and couldn't be found. Crumpled newspaper, sawdust, and wood fibers, or small scraps of leftover cotton, were tucked inside, creating the appearance of a full stylish headwear without using the additional ration fabrics. Some German officials reportedly wondered how civilians could maintain the appearance of such fashionable volume to their headwear, unaware that newspaper and sawdust were doing much of the work, making it look as though there were a lot more ration materials being used than was actually available to the standard civilian. Accessories were another way to assert individuality. Ribbons under 20 centimeters, artificial flowers, and decorative clips were added to hats, coats, and hairstyles, quietly signaling personality and creativity. These short ribbons, the ones under 20 centimeters, were particularly important because they weren't rationed, allowing women to decorate without risking penalties. Some women even incorporated touches of the French tricolor, slightly risky move there, that were blue, white, and red, into ribbons, hat bands, or embroidery, subtly expressing national pride under the watchful eye of the occupying forces. Scarce leather required additional ingenuity. Belts, bag straps, shoes were repaired or crafted by skilled neighbors using scrap leather or repurposed items. Civilians maintained identity, dignity, and a sense of culture in an environment designed to strip them of both. The very materials people had to work with were a product of the occupation and the war. With textile production largely diverted to Germany and luxury fabrics strictly restricted, what remained for civilians was often low quality, thin, and fragile. The available wool was often coarse, the cotton often frayed just after a few washes, and the dyes were muted or inconsistent. Clothing didn't simply wear out faster, it demanded constant care, repair, and creative enhancements to cover the blemishes, reinforce worn areas, and make garments function for daily life, as they had to stretch out the life of their clothing. This scarcity and fragility made dyeing and recoloring garments essential, World War II French families would repeatedly dye coats, scarves, and other clothing to restore the fading colors, cover stains, or simply make older garments look fresh again. Maintaining proper dress was not just practical, it was a way to observe cultural norms, even in time of hardship. But color wasn't just about tradition. Even small touches, a bright scarf, a carefully patched coat, or ribbon added to a hat could communicate personality and resilience. Clothing shortages in World War II occupied France were never just an inconvenience. They shaped family life, labor, identity, and ingenuity. Every patch sewn on clothing, every dye applied, every bag or glove made from scraps was a story of survival and creativity. These skills, these habits of improvisation, and the ability to make do under extreme scarcity became invaluable for those who would later join the Maquis and the greater French resistance. Civilians who spent years repairing, reshaping, and reimagining their world under occupation carried the tools, the habits, and the ingenuity that allowed them to better resist in the most dangerous circumstances while fighting the German occupiers. If you haven't caught the previous video, make sure to check it out. We discuss how civilians survived under extreme food shortages. You'll find the link down below in the description. If you have enjoyed learning about life in occupied France and how creativity and improvisation help people survive, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and that hype button if it is available on your mobile device. Doing so really helps this channel and helps this video reach more people like you who value history and the stories of ingenuity under German occupation. Share this video with someone who enjoys history and comment down below. What part of life under occupation surprised you the most? Are there details you'd add from your own research? I'd love to hear from you and comment down below. It's a great way for all of us to learn a little bit more together. Make sure to subscribe so that you can catch the next video in this mini-series on improvised France during World War II and see how it helped build the resistance. This is Brave Builds, where history, kit, and reenacting come together to help us build a better understanding of their bravery because their story deserves to be remembered.